Van Lobenfels.
Here.
Commissioner Ferguson.
Here.
Commissioner Chernell.
Here.
Okay.
We have a quorum?
We have a quorum? We have a quorum.
Yes,
Okay.
quorum is established.
Let me first start off by saying that I want to thank Julieta and Craig for their hospitality and opening up their winery and tonight's, thank you very much. Very much appreciated. Oscar, did you want to say anything?
No, just thank you very much. Very nice, beautiful place.
Okay, thank you. Now we have time for public comment. Is there anyone wishing to address the commission on items not on the agenda? Not seeing any. We'll move on to consent agenda, item 4. Can I have a motion to approve the consent? Motion by Natoli, second by Wynn. All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, Erik, regular agenda, receive executive director's report.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and commission members. I am struggling to retain my voice, but I will do the best I can here this evening. Might have to take some pauses and sip my hot tea in between. Just a few items I wanted to cover from my executive director report that's in the commission member packet. First off, the work continues on our update of the Land Use and Resource Management Plan, and you'll hear from the Delta Protection Advisory Committee Chair, Mark Pruner, in just a little bit about their most recent meeting on March 1st, where we visited with DPAC about proposed goals and objectives for the land use plan. But by the time the commission next meets, we expect we'll at least have a schedule for the commission subcommittee to meet and consider components of the Land Use and Resource Management Plan update. So more to come, but we're working diligently on that effort at present. Our levy financing feasibility study, that work is coming to a conclusion. We had a subcommittee meeting on February 2nd, and as a reminder to the commission, commission members Thompson, Van Lobenfels, and Chernell, along with Commissioner Ferrara, participated in that subcommittee meeting. We're working on some additional cleanup on the technical appendices to the report. I suspect we'll have a little bit of additional cleanup work to do on the draft report itself, but for the most part, that had that got a clean support at the subcommittee meeting, and my anticipation is that this will all come to the commission at the May meeting. We'll bring the final report and the proposed transmittal statement to the commission at that time. Moving on to the Delta Leadership Program, I just want to remind commission members that the final seminar for our 2018 group of participants is on May 4th, and that will be followed by a late afternoon reception beginning at 4:30 p.m. at Bogle Winery, not too far from us here. And we'll issue an invitation as we get closer to that date, but I hope you all will mark your calendars and plan to attend the concluding reception for the Delta Leadership Program. And as in years past, we'll have the participants in the program attend the Commission's May meeting and make presentations on their class projects. I won't say anything about the land use comment letters unless there are specific questions about any of them. I do want to take this opportunity to welcome a new commission staff person, Jeremy Terhune. The back of the room started
welcome.
As our new associate environmental planner on Monday of this week. Most recently, Jeremy was with Valley Vision. He's a Stockton resident, He sits on the San Joaquin County Ag Advisory Board and is a founder of a Stockton-based nonprofit called Puentes that operates a community garden on Boggs Tract, which is where the Port of Stockton is. He's been involved in a lot of community efforts in Stockton. And Jeremy will be focusing on our recreation efforts. But we're really happy to welcome him. You might have noticed us all taking a photo by the front door. We're now 100% staffed for the first time in a long time. And so you'll see that photo up on our website. But we're real pleased to have Jeremy join us and the additional activity around the office. My next to last item I wanted to mention was not in my written report, but it's kind of a late-breaking item, and it has to do with legislation. Assemblyman Jim Frazier has two bills that he introduced that I wanted to give a briefing to the commission on. The first is a bill that its bill number is 1876, Assembly Bill 1876. And as introduced, it would increase the Delta Stewardship Council membership to 11 members from the current 7 by adding additional Delta representation. And yesterday, the bill was amended to sunset the Delta Stewardship Council on July 1st of 2020 and assign its responsibilities to the Delta Protection Commission. Now, the bill will be heard it's scheduled to be heard next Tuesday in the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. And should the bill move forward, and it's probably a pretty steep hill for it to climb to move forward, I'll prepare a more detailed presentation for the commission at the May 17th commission meeting and queue it up for possible commission consideration and recommendation.
Eric, if I may interrupt you.
Yeah.
I spoke with Frazier's office today. That bill is not going to be heard until probably the first or second week of April. But the details you provided are still
Okay.
the bill as is. So
Yeah, if it's delayed until then, it still we'll have more information on it. If it's something that is appropriate to queue up for the commission at the May meeting, we'll do so. But truly the definition of a late-breaking item, just saw those amendments today, in fact, and it was amended yesterday. The second bill is also authored by Assemblyman Frazier, and I wanted to mention it because of the Commission's interest in the abandoned and derelict vessel issue. The bill number is Assembly Bill 2441, and it would redirect State Land Commission lease revenue within the 5-county Delta region from the state's general fund to a new account for removing abandoned and derelict vessels in the Delta. And the bill's awaiting a hearing in the Assembly Natural Resources Committee. But I wanted to mention that because of the past presentations we've had at the commission about that issue and knowing of the interest of many commission members in that topic. And then, Mr. Chair, my final report I wanted to make before I conclude is to let the commission members know that just this week I was invited to participate in a program called the American Leadership Forum. It's a 12-month program. It's based in the Sacramento region. It covers largely the SACOG region, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments region. Over the course of the 12 months, it would entail 16 work days to attend seminars. I'd be participating with a group of other people. I don't know who those other people are yet, but there are other leaders from throughout the region. There is a tuition proposed, and in consultation with Chair Thompson, my proposal to the conveners of the program is to have the commission support me through partial tuition, to request a partial scholarship, and to make a personal donation toward participating in this program. The intention is to keep the cost commensurate with what the commission has spent in years past on similar leadership development type efforts, most recently with our former Assistant Executive Director, Catherine Caldwell. And I will note that two of our commission members, Vice Chair Villegas and Commissioner Cabalden, are alums of the program. I hope I didn't miss anyone when I said that. I think those are the only two names I pulled off of the list of alums. And my intention, assuming that they agree with my proposal for a partial scholarship, would be to participate in that program beginning in May. And that concludes my report, unless there are any questions, Mr. Chair.
No questions, just a couple of comments about our colleagues on the commission. Our own very Jenny Lester Moffett got promoted. She's now the Undersecretary of the California Department of Food and Ag. She'll remain a member of the commission. She's not feeling well today, so she'll be back at our next meeting. Then Brian Ennis is appointed by the governor as Secretary of California State Transportation. Kate White will continue to serve, but is absent today as well. And then our colleague from City Council of Pittsburgh, I believe, Juan Banelis. This would have been his last meeting. He's out of town, but my friend and colleague from the City of Rio Vista, Mayor Cott, will be taking his place representing the cities. And if I may just comment on Erik's thought about how to pay for the what did you call it exactly?
American Leadership Forum.
American Leadership. You know, I appreciate Erik's willingness to put his personal monies in, but I've always been a strong believer that education is a benefit not only to Erik personally, but to the commission. And I would hope that we could see that if we could get a scholarship from the organization, that would be great. But I would hope that we could at least pay for half of the tuition, and hope that the scholarship would come forward. I appreciate Erik's wanting to pay part of that, but I just think it benefits this commission as much as any commission would. So anyway, I hope we can think about that. I don't know how you want to bring that back to us, Erik.
Well, unfortunately, time is of the essence on this. They're looking for a commitment soon, and so my intention would be just to participate, certainly to keep the commission contribution to a level that's commensurate with what we funded for other commission staff in the past.
And this tuition is not inexpensive. It's, how much is it?
The total tuition for the program is $12,500, but my proposal for the commission would be to cover $5,500 of that amount. So.
And you would put in your personal funds.
Yeah, and
that's
I
do
feel strongly it wouldn't be as large a contribution as the commission's, but I do feel strongly it would. This certainly has some personal benefit to me. I think has good benefit to the commission and the work we all do in the Delta. So I feel comfortable with that proposal.
Let me just, could we take an action on that?
We haven't agendized that for action, unfortunately.
Okay.
So can we let our wishes be known that we would like to pay half, what is it, 6,200, 250?
Yeah, that would be half of the amount.
Right, I appreciate those words. I mean, Erik, you know, being the person who said I'll pay for part of it, but I think we ought to recognize the value that the commission gets with Erik going to this.
I agree.
So I think, any other comments about feelings on whether or not we pay half? Chuck?
Do we have the funds budgeted?
Erik, the funds budgeted?
Yeah, the intention would be to have this occur over the 2 fiscal years, so that would be my proposal to the participant, or to the organizers of the program, that half of the payment would come in this fiscal year and the other half would come in the fiscal year beginning July 1st. And there is sufficient amount, even in our proposed training budget, for to cover that for both fiscal years. The total amount split over 2 fiscal years is what I meant to say.
The 12.5. correct?
Well, the proposed commission contribution, I still feel like it's appropriate to seek a partial scholarship for participation in this program.
Half of,
I mean, we're a small state agency. We don't have the benefit of having quite the large budget that a lot of our sister agencies do, and so I feel that's an appropriate amount. It certainly would fit within our commission budget.
Okay, so what you're saying, and I haven't looked at the details of the overall budget. Do we have a training budget in our current fiscal year available?
Yes.
And what's that amount, do you know?
Well, it's a somewhat fungible amount because our commission budget has a line item for operating expenses, and then we create distinctions among different line items within that budget. But the amount that we have budgeted for all staff for our training budget in the current fiscal year is $5,000, and we have spent some of that. We're big believers on. I'm a big believer that staff should take advantage of training opportunities that will benefit their work. But even though we've taken advantage of those opportunities, there's still room within that budget amount to cover half of this proposed contribution that I would suggest the commission would make.
And what fund would that come from?
Well, all of our funds are either from Environmental License Plate Fund or Harbors and Watercraft Fund. But the Environmental License Plate Fund would be the funding source.
Okay.
Was that the question?
Well,
the source?
within our budget, where we get our revenues, but as far as our expenditures, with the city or a county, it's a general fund where you take up the slack when you run short on particular items.
Yeah, the commission's entire budget comes from two special funds. We receive, well, let me back up. We did receive general fund money in the previous fiscal year budget for a one-time expenditure. That was the update of our economic sustainability plan section related to agriculture. But the commission's operating budget, the day in, day out budget of the commission, comes from two special fund sources. Environmental License Plate Fund is the primary source, and Harbors and Watercraft Fund
Right.
is makes up the
I saw
remainder.
that in our
Yeah,
staff.
and that's on page 5
Right.
of my report, which I didn't spend time going over, but the numbers for the overall commission budget are there.
I guess where I'm coming from is, I certainly appreciate your willingness to contribute personally to this. However, from what you've said, and I don't know the details, it would seem that not only for this commission and certainly your position would be valuable for you to attend this particular program. I'm not a spendthrift by any stretch of the imagination, but it would seem that the commission, unless we're in dire financial straits, in regards to balance our budget at the end of the fiscal year, it would seem to me that we would make a more generous effort, I guess, in regards to providing the funds for this. Again, because it's things, whether it be you or the rest of the staff, things that you receive in regards to certification or training, things like that, benefits this commission, this body, and ultimately benefits the people that we represent. So I see it as something that is important but probably valuable to this commission and certainly to what we try to do by virtue of your increased, I want to say training, but certainly education. But on top of that, and I find it and I'm sure my fellow commission members find that some of the real value in participating in these groups is the relationships you develop and the contacts for the future, which become invaluable because you just know who to call when things come up. So I see an investment in regards to you, but also a return to us, and that's why I would say that I would be, just me personally, I would be a little more inclined to contribute more as long as the funds are available. We're not in real troubled times in regards to our budget, because it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's you or the staff. $5,000 or or 5,500 is a lot of money. And I understand you're the recipient of it, but I think more importantly, we're the recipient of the benefit of you going through this program. Just my thought in regards to what you've done.
Diane?
Since this wasn't agendized, I would recommend that.
There's always a parliamentarian in the
We've
audience.
received notice that you attend. I think there's probably some indications of some support, but maybe we can agendize it for the next one and then retroactively commit some funds, or would that be a
If it's helpful,
possibility?
just to be clear, there is delegated authority, the commission has delegated authority to staff to make these budgetary decisions of this magnitude. So it doesn't, need to be voted on by the commission. And I think the executive director's intent in bringing up this important program and the opportunity for capacity building through this program and the proposed financial arrangements is really just being very above board and transparent about the process. The parallel of prior training opportunities and leadership development programs undertaken by other staff members who are not the executive director himself. Those can be approved by the executive director level. It's just because of the nature of this situation that kind of getting the temperature reading of the commission has been quite helpful. Have I stated that accurately?
Yeah, very much so. It's just a little, normally I would be approving these things because they would involve the commission staff, but this involves me personally, so.
I believe
Let's do
in
this,
investing
Diane.
in our leadership.
Why don't we give direction that Erik try to negotiate as much of a scholarship as you can, and then
That's always my intention. I'm
Right.
flinty when it comes to our budget, so.
right. So I think that would be the direction. Why don't you see what you can do in negotiating a tuition ad? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all, Chuck. Thank you, Diane. Appreciate the comments. Okay. That's.
Yeah, and that
your
concludes
report.
my report, Mr. Chair.
Okay, move on to item 6. Receive a Delta Protection Advisory Committee DPAC report. Mark Pruner, Chair. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission.
You might have to push the button, Mark, so the green light's on.
Push. Oh, the green light's already on?
There we go.
Perfect. Great.
I'll just hold it. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming. I just live up this road, so you're kind of in my neighborhood, and if it was a little drier and maybe a little lighter longer, I might ride my bike if I could do that. Erik suggested that.
We've
So-
heard that before.
Thank you for coming. I just also want to say that this facility that you're sitting in now used to look like that photo just to the right of the door. I know it's hidden by the screen. It was maybe relatively is a generous term. It was an abandoned structure. And this is what you're in a perfect reuse facility. It's a winery. It's functioning over there. They have processing capabilities. They have their own label, and they're up and running. This is an example of what the Delta is doing, and with your support, more of this can happen. So you're sitting in actually the fruit of your labors, as it were. So please come back and let all your friends know about Julietta Winery, and thank you again for coming. If you haven't talked to proprietors, they're behind me. They're being nice and quiet and polite, but they're smiling. Yes, they would love to say hello to you and ask you to tell all your friends about Julietta. We had our Delta Protection Advisory Committee meeting on the 1st of this month, and we had elections. So I was fortunate enough to be reelected as chair. Barbara Daly as vice chair. We had, I want to say, we met at Walnut Grove, and I had reported at our last meeting we tried to hit the road by going down to Discovery Bay, and we're currently in the process of seeing if we could meet in Ileton. Still Sacramento County. We kind of want to get around to the other counties, but it's my intention, it's the committee's intention to take our show, so to speak, on the road. We just want to reach out to people in the Delta to enlarge the pool of comments and participation that we receive, and that we can in turn then process and pass along to you. I think we had almost 100%, pretty close to 100% attendance. Melinda was sick, we have one vacancy. Eric can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe a couple of folks couldn't make it, but pretty close to 100%. We had a very long discussion with staff about the current state of the land use resource management plan. As you know, that's the primary land use regulatory document the commission processes and passes and engages in. One of the big issues that came up is the designation of the legacy communities as secondary or primary zone. Our understanding, and I can get corrected by the expert here, Melinda, that the legacy towns generally are considered or treated as secondary zone properties or areas. It's the thinking, I believe, and from talking to people that I know, that most folks living in those legacy communities think they're in the primary zone. And so for uniformity and consistency and bringing land use decisions within the jurisdiction of the commission, we didn't take a vote per se, but I think with rather unanimity, we expressed the desire to include legacy towns back within the primary zone. So there's some discussion about that. Some details have to be worked out, but I expect to bring that issue before you again. But that's a pretty big issue, and that would be a significant change from the current status to what's new and upcoming. I also asked the committee to consider the thought process of whether or not to recommend at some later point to you the thought of, this is a little bit ill-formed as yet. Let me backtrack. The Delta Plan currently is organized in its 3 substantive chapters, 3, 4, and 5, 3 being water conveyance, 2 being ecosystem restoration, and 5 being the Delta's place. Those generally are set to line up with Water Code Section 85054 and 85020B, which say the dual goals of the Delta are water conveyance and ecosystem restoration, but they must be accomplished in a way that enhances and maintains the Delta's place. I'm summarizing, not all the exact words. I think we all know what I'm talking about. It looks like from the statutory construction that enhancing the Delta's place is an integrated part of water conveyance and is an integrated part of eco-restoration, not something that's considered separately. Stated another way, the organization of much of the regulatory structure, especially a Delta plan, treats Delta's place separately on its own rather than as part of the program for water conveyance and rather than as part of the program for eco-restoration. And we may come forward with Erik's guidance and staff's input with some thought and suggestion that that's not quite what the statute says. And we would maybe possibly ask the commission to consider some reorganization of the Delta plan in particular to integrate into water conveyance and eco-restoration Delta as place concepts. So that's kind of a big topic, right? It's a kind of a big topic, and it's not easily expressed in a bullet point or two. And it's something to consider. So again, I just kind of highlight this. We haven't taken formal action. I took the temperature of folks around the table, and they generally seemed receptive to the concept of that I just outlined. They also seemed receptive to the concept of bringing that idea forward to the commission in a more formal, digestible format, something with a white paper, a little bit of background, and some clear recommendation. Lastly, I just want to thank Erik. He comes to every meeting. He participates in every meeting. He receives some rather hard questions from some of our members from time to time. And you know, he stands up for the commission. He stands up for what he does, and we get along, I think, great. We have good, thoughtful discussions that are fair and respectful exchange of ideas all the time. And my clear sense, I think I speak for everybody, is that Erik is completely in our corner and helping us to come forward with the best possible recommendations, the most thoughtful analysis possible to bring forward to you for your consideration. So it's my kind of a roundabout way. Those are, that's really an unseen thing, I think, but it's fundamental to the process and the functioning of the committee. And that is my report. Any questions?
Any questions for Mark? Mark, I just want to thank you and your committee for doing, sounds like a lot of good work. We haven't got the final version of it, but sounds like you've been very thoughtful of how you want to make those changes, and I think that's what you're all about, advising this group of individuals who may not have the intimate knowledge of the Delta that you and your members do, and that's what we really do need. So thanks, Mark.
That's our goal. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to move on to item 7, presentation from Campbell Ingram on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy activities.
Good evening.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here again. I'm going to talk about 3 items tonight. I'll talk about our Proposition 1 grant program. I'll talk a little bit about what we call our Central Delta Corridor Partnership Planning effort, and I'll give you a real quick update on the Delta Signage Program that we're working collectively with Delta Protection Commission. The first thing I want to hand out is just a 2-sided sheet that lists all the projects that we received in our Prop 1 solicitation this year. So our Prop 1 solicitation is for ecosystem restoration projects in the Delta. This is our 3rd cycle. Our first 2 cycles were somewhat underfunded or undersubscribed. We only moved about $10 million in our first 2 cycles. But in this cycle, we had really good response. We received over 20 proposals requesting about $26 million in restoration projects. We do a 2-step process where we do a concept proposal, then a full proposal. We had, of those 26 that applied concept proposals, 13 put in full proposals requesting about $22 million. So we have up to $18 million, or approximately $18 million to award in this round. We're currently finalizing our staff recommendations, and the board will consider those recommendations the 28th, a week from next Wednesday, at our regularly scheduled board meeting. I want to talk just a little bit about the review process for these projects. We do an administrative review, and that is looking at having staff look at eligibility of the applicants, legal review. The staff also notifies about 80 individual organizations in the Delta, from local governments and districts, water agencies, tribes, and about projects that are within their jurisdiction. We present to the Delta Stewardship Council and get their feedback on adaptive management, best available science, and consistency with the Delta plan. And then we also have the Delta Water Master review the proposals to look at water right issues to make sure those issues are all okay. We then have a technical review panel, and that is state and federal agencies that looks at the merits of the proposals. And Erik, thank you to you and your staff on the Delta Protection Commission for participating in that. Also, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources, California Department of Food and Agriculture reviews them as well, because we have agricultural projects, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and NOAA Fisheries. So that body reviews a suite of 10 criteria, most of what you would expect. How well is the project described? Is it compatible with our requirements and state requirements? Is it ready to move forward? Is there local support? We judge local support by letters of support for the project, as well as county resolutions that the applicants get for most projects. And does it have scientific merit, and are the performance measures well articulated so that we can evaluate the success of the proposal? All that adds up to 100 total possible points, and only projects that score at least 75 points can actually move forward to be considered by the board for approval. So again, we have the list of projects you have there. Just simply describes the name, the applicant, a brief description, whether or not it's an implementation project or a planning project, and the dollar amount requested. As I mentioned, the board will consider recommendations. Our recommendations will be posted publicly next Monday or Tuesday, and at that point you all will be able to look at far more detail. Particularly, you'll be able to see whether or not the project scored high enough and is actually recommended, There's a 3 or 4 page write-up for each of those projects. You can look at that. If any members of the Delta Protection Commission have any comments, you're welcome to provide them directly to us. They can be considered by our board on the 28th, or as in the past, Erik is a conduit for questions, and he will be at the meeting and can provide any comments. The board will look at each project individually and determine whether or not they want to actually award funding to it. Once we're done with that, we start over almost immediately. We will take our grant guidelines for our 4th round to the board at our May meeting. Those will be out for 30-day public comment. You all are welcome to comment on that. And then we would hopefully open the solicitation in early July for the next round. We anticipate probably having 2 more rounds after the current round. Any questions on Prop 1? Yes, sir.
I just happened to see that San Joaquin County is not involved. That's probably 300, 400,000 acres. And we got Contra Costa, Yolo, Contra Costa, Yolo, Sacramento, Contra Costa, Sacramento. And this is the Delta.
Yes.
It seems pretty odd.
Yeah, it's...
Enlighten me.
Sure. Proposition 1 requires that we do an open solicitation process. So we do quite a bit of effort, outreach, talking to people, applicants, partners that we know that potentially have projects. What is it you can do? Is our funding compatible? But that's the limit of what we can do in terms of directing funding. We open the door, we accept applications per our grant guidelines that are approved by our board. We evaluate the proposals and we make funding decisions. So
our county application wasn't up to snuff.
I'm not sure out of the 26 if we had any applications from San Joaquin County, but if we did, then that would not that they wouldn't be up to, I'm sorry, let me be very clear here. Out of that 26 proposals that came in, we reviewed the concept proposals and provided feedback to the applicants. It's up to the applicant entirely whether or not they provide a full proposal through the process.
Well,
so those 13 proposals that you see, none were in San Joaquin.
Okay.
Sorry, Supervisor Wynn.
Okay. Supervisor Miller's the chair. She is indeed.
Any other
She's
questions
not here, so we can blame her, right?
I'm not gonna let you guys do that. I'm gonna stand up for her as a councilwoman in Stockton. Protect her interests when she's not here.
San Joaquin did well last round, though, right? Is that San Joaquin? I thought did pretty well last round. It's a different category, but I thought San Joaquin was pretty well.
I think so. We do have a map, and you'll be able to see a map in the board packet that actually shows we are definitely getting concentrations, and San Joaquin is not as well represented for sure. Any other questions? Okay, next, this map around. I think the last time I was here, I provided an overview of the Central Delta Corridor Partnership Planning effort that we had started. And this was out of recognition that, you'll see the map as it comes by, that we now have a really interesting swath of what we call publicly owned or publicly financed lands in the Delta. For a long time, we've heard the Delta communities request that restoration happen on publicly owned, publicly financed lands. We thought, let's bring those landowners together. It's a significant corridor that runs along the McCollum down through the Western Delta. That's also a significant ecological corridor. Can we work with those landowners to think about how we achieve ecosystem benefits on publicly owned or publicly financed land? So we brought that group together, and over the course of about 12 months, hammered out a process to develop a strategy for that corridor. Our board approved that strategy and funding to help fund that strategy at our last board meeting, and we'll have our kickoff meeting starting at the end of the month on the 29th. The intent here is to have an open process with all interested stakeholders, agencies, the landowners themselves, and experts, and try to run through a very quick 9-month process to look at this corridor and see if we can't coordinate management, get ecosystem benefits out of the corridor, but also keep an eye towards agricultural sustainability, flood protection, and water supply. It's really interesting when you bring these agencies together, these entities together that own these lands. Yes, they are publicly owned or publicly financed, but they still have bottom lines. They still have to keep their agricultural production up to be able to maintain their levees and general operations and maintenance. So So they're very interested in considering how do they keep their agricultural, their agricultural operations viable, as well as create ecological benefits, thinking about flood protection and water supply as well all along. So the process is going to be the key, the capstone to the process really is a 1.5 day long charrette style event with, again, the landowners, subject matter experts, agencies, and Delta interest going island by island and really thinking about what are the opportunities, what are the constraints that result around those opportunities, and how do we think about this corridor as a way to achieve ecological objectives and maintain its viability. After that 1.5 day event, we have 3 half-day workshops planned where we'll try to hammer that into a high-level strategy that has local support and buy-in. In advance of this, we've got 3 planning meetings. Our kickoff meeting is the first meeting coming up on March 29th. And those meetings are really intended to have the landowners as well as Delta interests come together. And how do we plan? How do we make this process and that charrette event as efficient and effective as possible? Get all the information. One of the first objectives will be to really talk about outreach. Who do we need to make sure understands this process and has the opportunity to participate if they want to participate? We want to make sure that anybody that's got an interest feels welcome, knows that they have a seat at the table, and can participate in moving through the process. Eric has agreed to attend the first meeting, and I'm hoping all the meetings and help us certainly start to identify, again, a good outreach strategy so we make sure that we have everybody participate. So again, the hope is, and just the partners here, you have DWR, Metropolitan Water District, the Nature Conservancy, BLM and TNC going up into the outside the corridor, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Stone Lakes, California Waterfowl Association is a participant today on Quimby Island, and we've been reaching out to the folks on Jersey Island as well because they have some interest in thinking about how to manage their islands in the near term. Again, our hope is that we come out with a high-level strategy that helps inform how we spend the rest of Prop 1 effectively, as well as future funding sources as we move through time.
Campbell, quick question, and for the benefit of the commission members, if you did a quick summary of the different land ownerships, but we've talked about some of these properties at different commission meetings.
Right.
For the larger ownerships only, and specifically the Nature Conservancy, MWD, DWR, can you point out to people on the map where those ownerships are? I think it's a good opportunity to remind commission members of who owns what in that part of the Delta.
And I would like to be reminded of what islands MIT purchased.
Great.
Metropolitan Water District?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why don't I'll do it from here. You can. Okay, so let's go from west to east, starting with Q there. That is Chips. Thank you. That's Chips Island. That was recently purchased in part by Metropolitan Water District, and is also then DWR, I believe, purchased the other half. P and N and H are Sherman and Twitchell Islands. They're currently owned by Department of Water Resources.
Largely owned by DWR.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just do it in alphabetical order so it's easier for us.
I can, certainly. Okay, so then starting from the north, A is Stone Lakes Reserve, Wildlife Refuge, Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. B and C are essentially the Cosumnes River Partnership, but a lot of BLM owned land, Department of Fish and Game owned land, and TNC owned land. D and E is McCormick Williamson and Delta Meadows State Park. So D is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and of course E is the California Department of Parks and Rec. I'm sorry, and I didn't mention the Department of Parks and Rec as participants. F is Staten Island, owned by the Nature Conservancy. So then we go G, H, K, and L in that cluster. Those are the islands owned by Metropolitan Water District. So Bolden is G, Webb is H, Holland is K, and Bacon is L. J is Frank's Tract, largely owned, I guess, by Department of Parks and Recreation. And I is Webb Tract. I'm sorry, I blew that, sorry. H is Twitchell Island, sorry. G, I, L, and K are metropolitan. So I is Webb, G is Bolden, K is Holland, and L is Bacon. And then J is Frank's Tract. O is Dutch Slough, that's owned by the Department of Water Resources. H is Twitchell, N is Sherman Island, and P is Sherman Lake. And all three of those are owned by the Department of Water Resources. Any
That's
questions?
great, yeah, thank you. That's a mouthful.
It looks like your selection of these islands is really bent towards state agencies. Like, the state has money to do this and they give it to themselves. Between DWR and MET, which is the same as the state. And when we got little bumps and it just seems a little tilted.
Well, I think, so the intent here was that, you know, again, for the longest time, we've heard from the Delta community that there's a preference that if you're gonna do restoration, do it on publicly owned land. There's a fair amount of publicly owned land or publicly financed land out in the Delta. Do as much on those islands as you can without taking additional land out of private ownership or out of production. So that's why this group got together, because all of those islands were actually funded by the state and or other public sources. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has federal dollars. And so they're publicly owned or publicly financed. The Nature Conservancy uses public dollars to buy Staten and McCormick Williamson in the past. So again, the idea is all these islands are not going to take private land out of production. They're already purchased with state dollars, and you can achieve these benefits with hopefully a little bit easier because everybody is already in agreement and they own these islands. You're not going to have to acquire land. You're not going to have to.
How about MET?
Metropolitan Water District is.
It's not state funded.
No, it's not state funded, but it is funded by their ratepayers. So they are a joint powers authority. So it's considered publicly funded as opposed to publicly owned. I guess they would almost be publicly owned as well. They are a joint powers
And I have
authority.
a second question.
Yes.
On the streets and on the water in the Delta right now, Conservancy is putting out quiet inquiries about selling. Is that anything that you can address, or is that still under the covers?
Well, so just the distinction is we're the Delta Conservancy state agency, and that's the Nature Conservancy that owns Sherman or Staten and McCormick Williamson. And I know there are discussions that are happening, but I don't really know the latest.
So could they sell to a private farmer, or they have to stay within some kind of a conservancy model?
I think the main issue there is that there are easements on that property that are in perpetuity. So whomever they would sell to would have to maintain the integrity of those easements. Okay, any other questions on that? All right, I won't take up much more of your time. The last thing I want to do is just do a very quick update on the, the Delta signage plan. Again, this is a joint effort between the Delta Protection Commission and the Conservancy. Hopefully, I think you're all aware that it's been an effort to work with interested people in the Delta to really think about the signage in the Delta that welcomes people to the Delta and promotes the Delta. Have it evaluate where the signs are, where we could add more, maybe think about the look of the signs and for a little more consistency to help promote the Delta. The exciting news is that the draft of the plan, the first draft of the plan, will be publicly available on the 4th of April. So you all will have a chance to take a look at that. And then if you look on the flyer here, April 12th, there'll be a public meeting in Walnut Grove at the library to just present the draft and get public feedback. On May 3rd, there will be a similar meeting down at the Big Break Center, again, to present the draft and get feedback. The expectation then is that we would incorporate all that feedback and hopefully finalize the document by the end of May. It's important to recognize that this is guidance. The idea is with a more consistent look and a more thoughtful approach to where we put these signs, we can drive more people to the Delta, have them better understand what's available to them, but we're not going to dictate to anybody how they need to do their signs or how things ought to be. Okay.
What's the idea behind that? Tell them where they are or where they're going or what?
Well, what the group has looked at is sort of those signs that you see around the Delta. You know, you're entering the Delta, and you know, do we need more of those signs? what should those signs look like? I think one of the things that is likely to be recommended, although I haven't seen the draft, is that those signs at least have the new Visit California Delta website available to them, so somebody could see that and know that they can click on that and learn more about the Delta. So again, there'll be a series of recommendations for what those signs, how they might look in the future.
Any other questions?
I think my age group will probably look at the signs, and my son and daughters will probably Google it.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's this www stuff? Okay.
All right,
Campbell,
thank
was
you
that
very
it?
much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to item 8. We're going to receive a report on the California WaterFix from Erik.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And on your request, I just pulled together a current update on where the California WaterFix project is. And this might be something that's old news to some around the table. So I'll try not to go into too much detail. I do want to summarize a few of the more recent actions for the benefit of commission members who have not been following this as closely. In February of this year, Department of Water Resources announced a phasing plan for Cal WaterFix, which would include a first stage, or what they call stage 1, with 2 river intakes, each with a 3,000 cubic foot per second capacity, and also including 1 main tunnel, 1 intermediate forebay, and 1 pumping station. And then a stage 2 that would occur at a later date that would consist of the 3rd river intake that would again have a 3,000 cubic foot per second capacity, along with a main tunnel and a 2nd pumping station. Those 2 stages in total would be the current Cal WaterFix project, but again, the announcement from Department of Water Resources is that the project could proceed in stages. And of course, the first question I had about that was, does that change anything about where those proposed river intakes are? It does not. And actually, I don't have a map. I probably should have included one, but if this does proceed in phases, and if you all are familiar from the map with the 3 river intake locations, my understanding is that stage 1 would be the 1st and the 3rd intake locations, and that the 2nd stage would be the one in between the 2. That's terrifically helpful, I know, the way I described it, but and actually, I think I do have a map in here that was released at, I'll send this around. It does show the intake locations. This was a recent graphic that came out of the Cal WaterFix project. Subsequent to that February announcement by DWR, Metropolitan Water District, as was reported widely, had discussions and is considering proceeding at either a higher funding commitment than what they originally voted on, and possibly even being the sole funder for the WaterFix project, either the staged approach or the full-on project as originally proposed. And it has been reported, and it came out of a Met subcommittee meeting, that they expect to have a WaterFix funding proposal before their full board at their April 10th meeting. So more to come. Subsequent to the announcement in February, the Department of Water Resources released a cost-benefit analysis that was prepared by Dr. David Sunding as under the auspices of the Brattle Group. The analysis found a positive economic benefit to all users, both urban and ag. There, of course, is a minority viewpoint on that from Dr. Jeff Michael, among others, but that was an important action that recently occurred and something that the Delta Legislative Caucus had specifically asked for when they conducted their field hearing on Cal WaterFix in Walnut Grove several months back. On the litigation front, and I'll be very brief here because I know not to venture into litigation matters, but the CEQA challenges are now largely coordinated in Sacramento County Superior Court. Commission members probably know that there were a lot of different challenges to the approval of the environmental impact report. And in addition, more recently, there was a challenge from Delta interests over ex parte communications between the State Water Resources Control Board hearing staff and DWR staff. The State Water Board denied that request to delay the hearing over the potential conflict from those communications. Subsequent to that, a lawsuit was filed by several parties, including entities represented by commission members around the table. The Sacramento County Superior Court judge, and I don't have the judge's name, denied a temporary restraining order, but I'm told that a preliminary injunction hearing will occur in a few weeks on that litigation. And I know just enough to be dangerous on this, but that's the quick lowdown on the litigation front. On the permitting end, just a few things to mention. And this is in addition to what was out in the commission packet, but DWR did complete a CEQA addendum to the final EIR in January 2018. It addressed the relocation of the northern project transmission lines, so a very specific addendum on a very specific issue in the EIR. And then again in February, when DWR announced the phasing plan, they also announced that they would complete a draft supplemental EIR in June of 2018 and a final EIR in October of 2018 on the staged implementation option. And of course, more to come on that as we get closer to those dates. And then finally, the primary permitting action at present is before the State Water Resources Control Board. The board was requested to indefinitely delay what's called Part 2 of their hearings over the request to change the point of diversion for CA WaterFix. Part 1 was concluded, and prior to proceeding with Part 2, there was a request to delay that at least until the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation issued a record of decision. Part 2 has proceeded. It was delayed from January 18th. It started on February 8th. The board initiated a pause in those proceedings to consider the ex parte challenge that I just mentioned earlier. They rejected that challenge, and the hearings resumed for Part 2 on February 22nd, 2018. And it's a very aggressive hearing schedule. I'm not tracking it myself. I know that there are people in this room and representing agencies and entities that are paying close attention and tracking those hearings. At the conclusion of Part 2, the State Board is expected to develop the terms and conditions for the joint water right permit to the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. So activity continues. There's a lot more activity to come, and I might be able to answer specific questions any commission members have about this, but I did want to use this opportunity to at least hit the high points and put it all out there in one place. Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Questions? Yeah. Eric, since our Delta Protection Commission, is it possible that we could make a public stance or a public request or dissension or whatever? Because you know this decimate the Delta. So I'm looking at the title of Delta Protection Commission, and if we stay silent, then what are we doing? Or we can't by legislation, or we can't be politicized by our charter, or
Yeah, well,
educate me.
no, I'm sure it's the question on everyone's mind, especially out there throughout the Delta community. The Commission's primary involvement with Cal WaterFix has been to comment extensively on the environmental documents, and that began with Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and then it continued with the Cal WaterFix EIR, environmental document, EIR, EIS. And those were extensive comments. They were both, the BDCP comments were specifically brought before the Commission for approval, and the Commission did authorize the chair to send those comments. My recollection is that it was not a unanimous vote because we have state agencies on the Commission that obviously are, backing the proposal. I think the approach we took was a little bit different on Cal WaterFix. I think there was a good briefing before the Commission, but the final comments were actually sent out under my signature as executive director, so they were not formally approved by the Commission. I think that's the case. Let me see if I have a copy here that I can verify that that is indeed what happened. Well, there's BDCP. Yeah, those comments did go out under my signature, and that was intentional because of the timing of the Commission meeting, the timing of the comment deadline on the environmental documents. It would have been ideal to have brought a draft set of comments to the Commission for their review and action to take on whether it could go out under the chair's signature. The commenting on the environmental documents has really been the primary effort of the Commission. Obviously, we have a split Commission membership. There's many people around the table who are very opposed to the proposed Delta tunnels. We have state agencies around the table that represent the governor, so they obviously have a different position on this issue. And my own focus has been to try to keep the Commission out of the real intense, partisan, for lack of a better term, efforts related to the project, and really keep focused as much as possible on how this project would create impacts to the unique Delta values. And I think we did a pretty good job of that in the comments that we submitted on both BDCP and Cal WaterFix. And obviously, I conduct my efforts on behalf of you all as Commission members. If there's a different approach that the Commission would want to take on that, then the Commission can direct me to do so. But obviously, anything of that nature would have to be on a proper agenda and prepare the information, etc. But I hope that helps answer the question, and I think it's important to share that answer with people throughout the Delta region. I know there are people who do wonder why we're not more prominently involved with opposing the project or taking a stronger stance on the project. And I don't know that I've done a good job of answering it, but I could probably keep talking and maybe get to a better answer.
Well, I'm just, I'm just looking at the title of the commission, and I don't know why we wouldn't be out front on it, unless, like I say, there's some regulations, or that's not what we do here, those kinds of things, and I just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah, well,
I trust your way of approaching that, and that's probably more diplomatic and more effective.
yeah, I would say that, the statutory directives for the Commission are pretty broad, and, we're directed by statute to, again, I'll paraphrase here, to represent the Delta voice on these type of matters. And we certainly have directive in the statute to advise the Delta Stewardship Council on the Delta Plan and on the implementation of the Delta Plan, such as it affects the efforts to protect and enhance the unique Delta values, and that's agriculture, natural resources, recreation, and I'm always confused. I think heritage is in one part of the description of of the delta values and not in the other, but we'll include it here for this discussion. So we have a fair amount of latitude for how we go about doing that. I felt very comfortable with a deep dive into the environmental documents and really, providing a good analysis and a good perspective from the Delta region about how that project might impair, harm, affect the unique Delta values. Beyond that, I'm a little less comfortable respecting the full composition of the commission. So that would be my response to that.
Thank you, Eric. And George, just to remind you, the chair of the Delta Protection sits on the Delta Stewardship Council. Don was our first representative, and then it was Russo, I think, and then Mayor Bevo. I'm on it until the end of this year. And I think each one of us has represented the Delta Protection Commission views. Keeping in mind, there are some members that are state agencies, but I think, I'll speak for myself, I've gotten my point across as to what I think the values are of this body, and I hope I'm not misstepping or misspeaking, but we're there, we're articulating what the Delta Protection Commission is about, and trying to make sure that Stewardship Council understands it as well. Okay?
Well, I appreciate your effort.
Okay, very good. And Don and all of the chairs before me.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, and I think it's an appropriate question and certainly a timely one. And I seem to recall in Cortland, we took other actions as well in regards to positions on the conveyance system. And so I think certainly for new members, we ought, maybe if you could provide at the next meeting what actions we have taken, so that any new commission members know kind of what formal positions we've taken or otherwise. I think it's appropriate for everybody to kind of know what we've done over the course of certainly the last couple of years. Because there have been a series of different things we've done that might answer your question, maybe not totally to your satisfaction, but there are things we've done that might help.
Give me, in a sense, some
Yeah.
ammunition.
Absolutely.
Gives my
Yep.
colleagues.
Yep.
They don't know the inner workings, and I said, well, I've been on the board about an hour and a half. So I really don't know what
So
they've
you're an
done.
expert now, George.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm very happy that you brought that up, and I could bring you up to speed, and then I could pass that on. Because we have a lot of confidence in Eric and what he brings to the table, and so I knew you're doing something, but I didn't know what you were doing.
Well, and I really appreciate the comment from the vice chair. And as soon as you said that, I thought I should have included that in the staff report. I generally do whenever we talk about, and I just lipped it from the last one we did, but there was a good summary in a previous report on Cal WaterFix, and I'll provide that to Commissioner Biaggi. But it's a reminder that that should be incorporated into each and every staff report we do on this. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have comments? My counsel has advised me that I should be asking for public comment on each one of these items. I don't see anything in front of me, so I just keep rolling. But if anyone wants to come and talk about any item that we've already talked about in public comment, you're more than welcome. I apologize, I didn't mean to not include you. So, anyone wanting to come forward? Okay, I think I'm satisfied.
No, we have one.
Okay, good.
So I don't believe that there's been a meeting in Clarksburg on the sign plan. The signs at the end of the Freeport Bridge are a bit of a cultural thing in Clarksburg. I think it would be important to have a meeting in Clarksburg.
Thank you.
And I know that the signage you kind of hit it, but you know, not required for sign in, but we do like to do it right.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, sorry for that oversight. It won't happen again or I'll be in trouble with my counsel. All right, we'll move on to item number 9, and that's receiving an update on the Delta Community Action Planning Efforts, DCAP, by Blake Roberts. And is there a panel, Blake, or?
Yes, we'll have somebody, we'll have two panelists. I don't know if it's really gonna be a panel, if it'll be two speakers.
I'm just reading the
released.
script.
I know, I know.
And Blake, if you could make sure your green light's on there, I'm not sure you're, just for the sake of recording for the meeting.
We'll blame Eric on this one.
Okay, here we go. So my name is Blake Roberts. I'm a senior environmental planner. I'm the heritage lead, but I'm also a lead on the Delta Community Action Planning project, which has been sort of a work in progress for about 4 years now. I'll just give an overview of I don't think I've come to the commission specifically to talk about the DCAP process, but I think I just wanted to give an overview, kind of where we are, what we're coming up, and then sort of what next steps will be for the project. So originally, the community action planning process came out of the Delta Plan, which called for the commission and the Conservancy to work with local governments to prepare plans for each community, the legacy communities within the Delta. It identifies a few different things that could be in there, but it is kind of an open process. It's not, you know, it definitely provides some description of what would be in the document, but it's not terribly specific. So in case you're not aware of which ones are the legacy communities, I'll just point them out very quickly here. There's 11. These are pointed out in statute. So there's Freeport, Clarksburg, Hood, Cortland, sorry, it's hard to read that, Walnut Grove and Locke, Ryde, Isleton, Rio Vista, and then down here in Contra Costa County, you have Bethel Island and Knightson. Hopefully I'm not missing something. And this list actually is, oh, I forgot, and Rio Vista, of course. So there's kind of a question of what a legacy community is. The statute doesn't really define it, but the legislature obviously saw the need to create that category for communities that have been in the Delta for 50 plus years and have really provided, you know, it's really kind of these communities that really serve as sort of the heart of the Delta. And so when we were coming into developing the community action planning process, one of the things that we looked at was what have other communities done? And so even though we haven't done a community action plan for Rio Vista, we've drawn inspiration from Rio Vista and the process that happened with the Rio Vision process. And so one of the people that will be speaking after me will be Tom Sir with Rio Vision to kind of talk about what happened there. And really, that was a community-oriented effort to revitalize the community. It really wasn't a city effort. It was more of a public effort with a public organization, and that was really aimed at trying to get some things done in the community that really wanted to get done. We also drew inspiration from the city and county of Sacramento, who have created action plans in some of the neighborhoods and communities of the area. And really, the reason why we call them action plans is obviously we wanted these to be very action-oriented. This isn't your typical land use plan, but instead it's really identifying those issues in the community that the community cares about, and some actions that can help deal with those issues in some way. And so what we initially did is we had 3 initial communities. Clarksburg, Cortland, and Walnut Grove, where we went in and conducted public workshops. We had the assistance of Sacramento State's Center for Collaborative Policy, which does facilitation services. And they were able to really provide, during these meetings, we're able to really summarize what issues we're facing in the community, and then try to identify some things that can be done to do that. Currently, we are doing work in Hood and Isleton. Isleton, we did some public workshop back in July of last year. We were actually piggybacking on some of the planning efforts that they were doing within the community. In Hood, we're going to be having meetings coming up on Monday, March 26th, from 5:30 to 7:30 at the fire station, and then there will be another meeting on April 25th, which I believe is a Tuesday. And so these meetings are really aimed at, and what I should say is that prior to doing the workshops, one of the things that we do is we go and talk to key people in the community. We interview them for an extended period of time to really get a handle on what the issues are. Then we go and do a workshop, which is really saying, okay, here's some of the things that we found out during our initial round of interviews. Have we gotten this right? Are there things that that you want to add to this? And then we can go from there in order to define particular actions that can be done to sort of deal with those issues. And then finally, we come in with a draft community action plan, which can sort of provide, the template for where the community is going to go. So we haven't really put a restriction on what kind of issues would come up in the community action plans. So this is the great and the awful part of it for me personally, because there are times, honestly, I knew nothing about broadband before this process. But obviously, when we went into no surprise, broadband, cellular access is an issue in the Delta. I don't think I probably need to tell anybody here that. But I think it was helpful to go through that process and really say, okay, this is something that the commission and the communities want to be involved in, and the counties can be involved in. What can we do to kind of move that forward? Other things that came up were community amenities like parks, economic development obviously was an issue, especially in sort of the commercial districts within the communities. Education, in terms of, there was interest in having a bilingual program in Clarksburg, for example. Fire, law enforcement, emergency communications, this was something that happened probably everywhere. The issues kind of varied from town to town, but there was definitely that part of it. Also, governance and community communication. Cortland had the only town association, but there are other, in Clarksburg and Walnut Grove, there are sort of more informal organizations. So one of the issues that we faced in some of the towns were, so how do we get some community consensus here? How do we decide where the community wants to go when it's not necessarily a specific association that's in charge, or at least association that's sort of charged with that? Other issues that came up, healthcare. There's, as you may know, there's one doctor who practices in the Delta, in the primary zone. So obviously, and he's in his mid-80s. So this is a big, this is a big issue in terms of what is healthcare going to be like in the primary, especially in the primary zone. Historic preservation, that was definitely an issue in Clarksburg, but also in Walnut Grove and Cortland as well. Housing, obviously there's a need for, one of the things that was discussed was the possibility of having housing that can serve people throughout the years. So even though they might move into their later years, there's some place to live within their community. Public restrooms, also an issue, and transportation improvements were probably the primary issue, whether pedestrian, bicycle, or vehicular. So I'll just give you a little bit of sense on some of the actions that came out of this. In Cortland, one of the things that was discussed was having a long-term plan for the commercial district along River Road and for the Chinese American district. And then the discussion about Cortland Market and possibly doing having a public dock there. Water system challenges were also an issue there. I believe, and Supervisor Natoli would probably know this, I think there's 4 different water systems and they're not connected. So that's an issue. A public restroom, as I mentioned, that was something that could be an asset for businesses and visitors, especially because the Cortland Market would require any public restroom if it wanted to expand. The long-term plan for the property, that's sort of where the pear fair is. So there's a lot of questions about that large property and what's going to go on with it. Walnut Grove, also public restrooms. There's actually a public restroom that is, I believe, I'm trying to remember if it's in the design phase or it's being constructed. Yeah, design review right now. Walnut Grove has a lot of historic buildings and great districts. So one of the things that came up was the possibility of having, trying to have preservation within those buildings. Self-guided tour of the Walnut Grove. There's one from several years ago, but it needs to be updated. And then also, as I mentioned, Walnut Grove has no community association, so one of the questions that came up was, how do you create a representative forum for the town? So we did Cortland and Walnut Grove at the same time, so some of the actions that we had for those were joint. And so law enforcement was one of those issues, just making sure that there was communication between the communities and the county sheriff. Internet access, as I mentioned to you, was an issue. Electrical service, and then one of the things that was suggested was developing a federally qualified health center in the Delta for medical care. So in terms of next steps right now, obviously one of the things that we're kind of in the thick of right now is doing the Hood and Isleton action plans. But one of the things that I'm concerned about as a planner by background is that I do not want things to sit on the shelf. That is the worst thing ever to say to a planner. We did all this work, that nothing ever happened with it. I don't want that to happen with these. So one of the things I really want to be able to do through this is increase collaboration with different groups and agencies to kind of get the ball moving on things and make sure that the community is involved on a basic level. One of the things that's important for that is trying to find those projects that are easy, relatively easy to do, that are the low-hanging fruit that can kind of move things forward and build momentum for larger projects. One of the things that was identified, as I mentioned, is that there's these larger regional issues that came up. And so one of the things that we were talking about was perhaps trying to get some of the communities to work together to talk about some of these regional issues and sort of using that as a way to kind of express, even though it's on the community level, also express some regional issues, talk about regional issues. And then we've been talking about possibly expanding to other legacy communities as well. So that's one of the things that's on our agenda for later this year. So maybe I'll wait to answer any questions right now, or if it makes more sense. Yeah, if you have any immediate questions right now. But
I think we're good for now.
Okay.
We may call you back.
So one of the things that I was going to do is introduce my the two panelists tonight. The first is Tom Sir, who is Vice President of the Board of Directors for Rio Vision. So I'll introduce him.
Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, and thank you, Blake. Rio Vision began as an idea, and as I understand, this was before I actually got involved. As I understand, it was Eddie Woodruff, one of our former mayors, and some of you may know him because I think he was on the Conservancy. Made a suggestion to a group of residents about this program we heard about through the AIA, the American Institute of Architects.
Yeah, the
there we go.
the green light needs to be on.
There we go. So this group got together and put together a proposal to the AIA for the what's called the RUDAT team. The RUDAT, I think, stands for Rural Urban Design Assistance Team. I believe that's what it is. And lo and behold, we were accepted. And I think we were one of the very last of that program to be accepted. These teams had been around to a number of cities, Healdsburg and I think maybe Petaluma and some others, to talk and help advise the residents on how to develop their cities. And so we were very pleased to host them. This was in early 2013 for a madcap long weekend of intense activity that resulted in a pretty heavy document that was put together by this team of architects, city planners, transportation experts, financial experts, and so forth, as to sort of a blueprint for how we could move forward with the development of our city. And it included, the whole process included 2 very large meetings in Rio Vista that some of the old-timers told us were the largest meetings they'd seen ever in town, of about 400 to 500 people. So this created a lot of excitement, and the report was there, and we had this blueprint. Now, we immediately ran into a certain level of skepticism. Keep in mind that the RUDAT whole process was largely driven by sort of newer people in town. And newcomers in Rio Vista are sort of those people who have been in the town less than 3 generations. No, I do exaggerate a bit, but not that much. And so one of the first tasks that we had was to really build some credibility. Most of the old-timers said, hey, look, this is like the 3rd, 4th, 5th plan that we have had for how to do something in this city. It included the general plan, the waterfront plan, and most recently the PDA, right, was done in our city. And we don't believe this is going to happen. So that was our first challenge, was to do away with that. And so we did follow the advice of the planners, to borrow a term, of starting with the low-hanging fruit. And by that, it was discrete projects, easy to do, highly visible. And so we did launch a series of these programs, projects, under the leadership of Jim Wheeler, our first executive director, who was in fact a project person, so he knew how to do this. And as time went on and we garnered enough volunteers to really push some of these projects through, our credibility did increase, and to the point where now we're able to initiate things both with the community and with the city that people will pay attention to. So I think that was one very important part. Another approach that we took to this effort was to not try to do everything. I mean, we had our own projects. The purpose, in my mind, was to build our credibility and show we could do things. But really our role has been, our most effective role has been as a catalyst, that is to bring existing resources together, to work together on other projects. One example of this would be, it wasn't exactly our project really, but it sort of was, I think, to a large degree inspired by the level of activity that we had stirred up in the city. And that was the American Legion Post took over managing our Veterans Memorial Hall in town, which had been there for many years, but had really fallen into disuse and not well maintained and so forth. And these folks went to Solano County, and thank you, Skip Thompson, with his help. This facility has been completely refurbished. There is now a commercial-grade kitchen, lots of activities, and it's become really a very, very important focal point for the community. Things like that, and then other things have happened too in connection with the Chamber of Commerce, the city itself So catalyst is an important term here because it's really what we've tried to be. Not to do everything, but to help people come together and do things. The other thing that we've emphasized is communication and promotion. So that we're able to offer help to many other organizations in getting out the word, getting out the publicity for events, for whatever they're doing. Fundraising is a big project in our town. It seems like everyone complains every weekend there's another fundraiser. But that's how this town functions, really. These small towns raise their own money. We don't have the municipal resources to bring a lot of services into town, so it's done largely by volunteers. Rio Vision is entirely volunteer. There's no paid staff at all. Let me see. So those two things, the catalyst role and the ability to promote. Now, one of the things that we started very early on was a quarterly promotional magazine like you see in many cities. It's called Discover Rio Vista. We distribute it, well, we started out quarterly. It's now a triannual publication. But again, it's put together entirely by volunteers. It's inserted in the local paper. It is distributed widely by people like myself and others who go out every quarter and stick them around in all sorts of places, upriver and Lodi and Fairfield, all around. So that's part of our communication thing. In terms of heritage and legacy and so forth, this year we are celebrating the 160th year of the city's founding and the 125th year of its incorporation. So we're going to try to make a big deal of that. Looking to the future, we're now beginning to build on the credibility that we've built with the community and the city to really focus on economic development. And one of the key points of the RUDAD report was that you need to preserve and enhance your existing downtown. If you've all not been to Rio Vista, I'll describe it to you briefly. It's basically Main Street and Front Street, and that's it. Along with Highway 12, which goes sort of on the outskirts, but there's a lot of businesses there oriented towards the highway. But the real downtown is not, keep doing that. The real downtown is not on Highway 12. So you have to get people off of Highway 12 to come and look at our city. And it's a beautiful setting in that Main Street runs all the way down to the Sacramento River. And there's a boat dock there, which is now being refurbished, and thank goodness for that. It really needed it. So we have this wonderful waterfront setting. But if you look at the condition and the way the city's oriented, it's like our back is turned to the river. We haven't taken full advantage of the riverfront. And so that really is the challenge that we face now, is how to really preserve and maintain our downtown, get the city to stop letting things develop way outside of town, but to bring things focused in our existing commercial core. One of the things that's a real barrier for us in developing, especially the waterfront, is that without some flood mitigation measures in place, a lot of the waterfront can't be developed because no one's going to lend money to build something in a flood zone. So that's one of our big challenges. I think I should probably stop there. So thank you.
Any questions of Tom? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. You mentioned at the end there's some flood protection needs.
Yes.
And maybe I missed this in your description, but if I didn't, could you just run through quickly for us what that looks like from your perspective? What investment in flood protection would look like?
Well, I use the term flood mitigation or protection. I mean, what we're probably talking about is a flood wall. I mean, I'm not sure that that is necessarily the cure, but to a layperson, it looks like what we need is the flood wall that will keep the rising waters of the Sacramento out of certain areas so that we can develop those riverfront, those beautiful riverfront sites. Right now, the city with STA, Solano Transit Authority money, has started to develop a riverfront park, which you can do in a flood zone, because if it floods, you just wait for it to go away and then you come back and you still have a park. But to develop anything in those areas, you really need a flood wall or some way to mitigate flood danger. Yeah.
All right, Tom, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, Tom. So the next person I wanted to introduce is Amanda Beck. She's secretary for the Clarksburg Citizens Advisory Committee. Also is formerly the president of the Friends of the Clarksburg Library and a graduate of the 2016 Delta Leadership Program. And she'll be talking about some of the things going on in Clarksburg.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome.
So, one, I just want to say thank you to Blake for the time that he spent in Clarksburg. It was an interesting group of folks. You know, you live in a community, and sometimes you think you know everyone, and then you come to a meeting and you think you know everybody's opinions, and it's amazing to come around the table and really get a good sense of the differing of opinions and differing goals. So I think Blake was very good at facilitating all of us so that we didn't choke each other in our meeting or 3 meetings. So thank you. So I was going to focus my comments just on the planning process and then a little bit on what's happened in Clarksburg since then. So like I said, we had 3 meetings in 2016. Blake facilitated all 3 of those. I think it was probably a challenge finding a good place to meet. Clarksburg, we have one really community area that we meet. It's in the back of the library, which is managed by the Friends of the Clarksburg Library. So if you ever need a meeting there, we're happy to host you. So he facilitated those. I think the first meeting was just this brainstorming session, which I just found really really eye-opening. You know, Blake talked a little bit about some of the issues that had come up in other communities, and he did it tonight. Public restrooms are really an issue, and it's an issue in our community too. We have a lot of bikers that come through the community. We have wine tasting, which clearly requires a public restroom. So we have a need, and it's and so that was a very obvious one that people really clued in on. But there was a real difference of opinion about the biking community. People that weren't part of that community or don't bike and have to deal with people on their bikes on the levees, and they're nervous about hitting them, and they're nervous about injuring them, and then talking through how we have real constraints in that area of transportation because the levees are constrained on both sides. And then there's constraints in agricultural land that have different ownerships. It's typical development issues. So I think it was a big eye-opener to some people that there were those differing opinions. We talked a little bit about my personal pet issue, which is the interest in community meeting places, pools, things where we could teach safety to children that are here around. We have a lot of children in the community. We have water all around us. The need to just have a pool so people can learn how to swim and don't have to drive into town. And then that brought up things about the difference in language in the community, where we have a number of farm working families that are not English speakers, that need a place to go and need a place to understand what's happening in the community and how to better communicate in multiple languages. So I think that the facilitation helped to bring all of that out. We got it in a plan, and now we've done things. There was a large conversation about transportation. We as a community, I think Oscar will attest to this, Supervisor Villegas will attest to this. I think after that, those meetings, it kind of galvanized us to really reach out and communicate to our supervisor that we had an issue at the Freeport Bridge. so with the change, with the build out of the big shopping mall across in Sacramento County, we've had a lot of traffic that's come through on the east side of the river, so the Sacramento County side of the river. You cross over on Freeport Bridge and you have issues on the Yolo County side of the bridge. And, we're in Yolo County talking to our supervisor, and we're saying that there's traffic that's going from I-5 to 80 and cutting through the Delta to get there. And we're having huge backups. I mean, at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock on the bridge, you'd sit there for 20 minutes on one side just waiting. And so that galvanization, I think that helped people to realize that they can talk, they can call. And I think all of us probably did. I don't know how many, but I'm sure there were many that called and emailed and really that kind of grassroots, we need change. And we were able to, through Supervisor Villegas' help, get a 3-way stop at that bridge that I think has probably saved lives. It's definitely saved my time. And I think really helped a lot of people feel like there can be that low-hanging fruit that can make that change. So I think I think the effort's a great effort. It's hard to have grassroots work done. People are busy, they have busy lives. I have 2 kids, I've worked full time, I've participated in a bunch of boards, just like many of you do. And I think it's hard to do, but I think that this kind of an effort really helps in creating that support. So I want to thank the commission for allowing the staff to support our communities, and we're excited about the next step. I'm hoping to get my pool. Any questions?
Any questions for Amanda? Seeing none, thank you, Amanda. That's right.
One thing I did want to mention is that maybe before Supervisor Natoli has a chance to, well, he wouldn't toot his own horn, I'm sure. No. But one of the things that was identified.
I wasn't going to talk. I have a horn to toot. No,
okay. Well, one of the things that was identified in Walnut Grove, and probably the top issues that was identified in Walnut Grove, was the intersection of Walnut Grove Bridge and Highway 160. At that point, there was only one stop sign, and through one of the things that was really identified was that this is a hazard, and we need something to slow down traffic on Highway 160. And Supervisor Natoli was critical in getting that 3-way stop put in. So you can thank.
Oscar got his in about 4 months. It only took me 10 years. So.
I had to put my own in myself.
Oh, we've done a few of those. we had the Caltrans component with us. Yeah.
Thanks, Blake. Is that it, Blake? Any questions for Blake or no? Eric?
Just a concluding thought, Mr. Chair and Commission members, and I hope you got some benefit from this discussion. I certainly did, but this is an example of the type of activities we're engaged with to help protect and enhance the unique Delta values. This one has direct linkage to the Delta Plan. It's a policy in the Delta Plan. It's our responsibility to help the Stewardship Council to accomplish this. But it's the type of update I'd like to be providing on a more regular basis for activities that we're involved with as the staff to your commission to help protect and enhance the unique Delta values. And I really want to tip my hat to Blake and thank him for his efforts, but also a big thank you to Tom and Amanda for joining us here tonight.
Campbell.
I just want to make one quick comment. I want to make it very clear I'm not advocating. It's very speculative. But SB 5 will be on the ballot in June, and it will actually bring funding to the Conservancy that can help fund some of these things. We anticipate it directs us to use to identify priorities, and we would envision using these community action plans as well as the Delta marketing strategy to potentially form the basis for selecting projects that could be funded. It's a very small amount of money, but it is some funding that we might be able to interject in some of the high priorities on these.
Thank you. Mark, did you, and if anyone else would like to come and make a comment, feel free to do so.
I
filled out the card?
Speaker card.
Okay, perfect.
I just want to first of all, add my thanks to what Blake has been doing. I think his efforts really at the heart of what legacy communities are, the communities, the infrastructure, the water. And I got to one of the things that he pointed out, and I want to bring the commission's attention, I don't know how this can translate to an action item, but Sacramento has been selected as the pilot area for the upcoming 5G rollout. So I don't know if you know much about 5G. It will fundamentally change our lives, how we do things through our smart devices, our mobile devices of all kinds. The transmission speeds will be far greater than the 4G systems that now are in effect. Verizon anticipates a rollout by the end of this year. So assuming it gets pushed back like all things do, that'll happen. But if Sacramento is the pilot program, one of the primary pilot programs for the country, and if that pilot area can be expanded to the Delta, arguing that Verizon has a great interest in testing their product in a rural area, especially if it's in conjunction with a highly urbanized area. That's the benefit of them, and I think would be an incredible lift up in the infrastructure that I think the entire Delta requires and depends on. Blake pointed out to me that Yolo LAFCO has been kind of working on this over time. I don't know where they are. Now I'm keyed up to talk to their executive director. And I don't know how the commission could weigh in, but all of you come from jurisdictions where you have a real interest in making sure that our neighbors, your constituents, have access as soon as possible to this incredible new technology that's coming along. And I'll do my part to talk with Blake and other folks to see what little part I can do to advocate that the Delta is included in that initial pilot package, and I ask each of you to do the same.
I think the obvious would be a letter from our executive director to Verizon indicating our desire to have them look more broadly at the Delta when they're thinking about the Sacramento region.
That'd be great. A good first step. Thank you.
That seem okay with? Okay.
Thank you.
Don?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank certainly Blake and all the committee members and those that presented along with Blake this evening. Just note that on a couple of different topic areas that were talked about, certainly appreciate the work in the communities in Sacramento County, but obviously over time to get to the 11 communities in the legacy category. And something that's very evident certainly is the changing and the changed traffic patterns. I know that I had a meeting just about 2 weeks ago now with folks from the town of Hood and Caltrans, the Department of Transportation for the county. Again, just as was described a moment ago, we're getting folks coming off I-5, coming up the River Road, passing in through town. It's posted for 25. We've got a park and obviously crosswalks. But traffic enforcement obviously is a bit sketchy just because the main highways, obviously, the law enforcement agencies are responding to accidents and other priorities there. And we were down in Walnut Grove about 6 weeks ago, and on the east side of the river, we've got 7,000 vehicles a day coming through the town of Walnut Grove. Again, probably equal that amount in some of the other communities up and down the river. And I think it's going to be something that, certainly you want folks to know and to appreciate the communities, but also to drive respectfully and to recognize that these towns have people and children and businesses and activities that do require the folks pay attention, not just use them strictly for the commute routes. But I would just note that I think it's going to continue to be an emerging issue. Again, you want visibility and you want activity and visitors, but you also want respectful driving patterns. And I just think that the Delta roads are in a lot of cases not equipped to take heavy volumes consistently, and then you mix that in with your seasonal activities, your farming and sort of your recreational vehicles, and you've got some mixtures that could be very chaotic, if not something worse than that, in the event there were accidents and so forth. I also wanted to note that just in Sacramento County, we've been working with a couple of communities with Freeport. I've got a meeting in Hood that precedes the meeting that Blake and his folks will be having week after next. to talk about bringing sanitary sewer to the communities. We're doing some water system upgrades, and I think the community planning efforts, point I want to make for tonight's presentation, though, I think are helpful. They help folks to recognize some of those needs, to talk about them, and beyond communicating to those of us who are, serving at the local level, whether it be on boards of supervisors or reclamation districts or city councils. I think it's an important effort and certainly support it. I know Blake takes it very seriously, along with the folks that assist him in that regard. And so I just want to commend certainly Erik and your staff for their work. And I think it'll be one of those things that will evolve over time. I think you'll have some action plans, but obviously those will grow probably with some of the success stories that come out of some of those, issues that are addressed, initiatives that are addressed, but also ones that will be added over time too. So, but anyway, I just want to thank folks, and certainly I think it'll pay dividends for the communities in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. Any other comments?
Just a real quick one, if I could.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to maybe just follow up a little bit with what you just said in light of what, Campbell, you presented. One of the items you presented tonight was the opportunity for folks to chime in on some community meetings about some of the sign work that you're kind of undertaking. I actually would encourage you to consider looking at some of the plans where folks have spent the time coming out to talk about community values and their priorities, and maybe embed that at least as part of your consideration for what the signs ought to do and what they ought to say, maybe where they're placed. Because I think while you have meetings, and I would love for you to come to Clarksburg or add one more meeting to Clarksburg, I think maybe taking a look at those plans, because I think that already kind of reflects a lot of what folks have been thinking about, what their priorities are and what they might want to reflect in signage, rather than only using and I'm not saying you're only going to use these meetings, but I think it's another tool to use to embed as part of your public participation. Because I think, to Don's point, we are seeing, at least certainly in our respective districts, a huge increase in traffic that's disrupting kind of the quality of life, but it's the reality of life that folks are sort of taking detours now to avoid the heavier traffic, major arterials. And so I think I would just offer that as one more opportunity to sort of look into what folks are thinking about as some of these Delta communities are struggling with increasing traffic patterns, certainly. Yeah.
We appreciate that. It's been a challenge to bring people to the process. So
Yeah.
Any way we can get additional participation.
Terrific.
Okay, Oscar. Any other comments? Chuck?
Real briefly, just following up on Mark's comments, the 5G, he just touched upon it, but that is a tremendous benefit for those who have access to it. And it will be one of the key elements in regards to getting into, for example, transportation, autonomous vehicles, et cetera. So I congratulate them on getting there established. And I know San Joaquin County is looking at a similar system, different carrier, but we'll see what happens. But it is a great point.
Okay. If I don't have any other comments, commissioner comments or announcements? None? We'll adjourn. Our next meeting is May 17th in Portland. Thank you.
But